The ballroom inside the Vanguard Leadership Summit glowed under soft golden lights, casting a quiet radiance over polished marble floors and velvet drapes. Servers moved with practiced elegance, balancing trays of fine whiskey and sparkling water, weaving between tables filled with the country's most powerful executives, investors, and politicians. The air buzzed with the low murmur of private conversations, each table holding its own circle of influence deals whispered between sips of champagne. The walls were lined with dark wood panels, adorned only by subtle banners bearing the summit's emblem, a silver hawk poised mid-flight. It wasn't just a conference. It was a proving ground for those who saw the world as a game of winners and losers. No media were allowed inside, and only personal security and a few trusted aides were seated close by. At the far end of the room, the main stage stood ready framed by deep blue curtains and a sleek, minimalist backdrop. The schedule had been intentionally vague, teasing only the appearance of Garrett "Hawk" Morrison. He was a man well known in these circles, a best-selling author and former Navy SEAL who built an empire around his philosophy of aggressive dominance. His books promised success through unapologetic power, and his seminars sold out months in advance. Garrett strode into the spotlight, wearing a fitted black suit that hugged his broad shoulders, his military tattoos just barely visible at his collar. His sharp jaw and steely eyes commanded attention, and the crowd shifted forward, eager for his words. He carried himself with the precision of someone trained to scan a room, weighing every face, every potential threat. He began with ease, weaving stories from the battlefield into lessons for boardrooms, drawing knowing nods and approving laughter from the crowd. He spoke of pressure, of seizing control before others even realized they'd lost it. His voice carried the confidence of a man who had never been questioned. But, as he spoke, Garrett's eyes drifted toward a figure seated near the front, a man who sat with quiet composure amid the subtle applause and raised glasses. Chuck Norris, dressed simply in a dark jacket and open-collar shirt, watched the stage without a trace of reaction. His presence didn't scream for attention. It simply existed steady and rooted like an immovable pillar in the shifting tides of the room. Many of the younger executives only knew him from old action films or viral internet jokes, but those who had studied his legacy understood what sat before them. Chuck wasn't just a celebrity. He was a 6-time world karate champion, a pioneer who had redefined martial arts both on and off the screen. Garrett's gaze lingered, and the edges of his mouth curled into a faint, almost daring smile. He turned back to the audience, his voice dropping to a tone meant to challenge, not entertain. Power, he said, isn't something you inherit. It's something you seize. He paused, letting the words settle, then added, "Some people in this room built empires with their silence." Others, he said, shifting his gaze directly toward Chuck Hyde behind it. A few scattered laughs rippled through the crowd, unsure whether this was part of the act or something sharper. Garrett's words weren't shouted, but they struck like well-placed jabs, precise and deliberate. He walked toward the edge of the stage, eyes locked on Chuck, and continued. "I've spent my life proving that dominance isn't about waiting. It's about acting, and tonight I think it's time we show which path really wins." The room grew still, conversations dropping off like candle flames snuffed out in the dark. No one had expected this. A direct challenge issued with that cool, provocative tone that Garrett had perfected. Garrett's grin widened as he extended a hand toward Chuck, his voice carrying through every corner of the room. "What do you say, Mr. Norris, care? To give these fine folks a demonstration of your philosophy." The tension hung thick in the air, every eye flicking between them. No one moved. No one spoke. Chuck didn't flinch. He didn't glance around the room for support or respond with clever words. He simply sat there still as stone, studying Garrett with a gaze that revealed nothing and everything all at once. Garrett raised his eyebrows as if daring him further, but Chuck remained motionless, his quiet presence somehow more commanding than the challenge itself. Somewhere in the back, a nervous cough broke the silence, but it was quickly swallowed by the weight of anticipation. It wasn't just about the two men anymore. It was about what they represented. The room waited teetering between ego and discipline noise, and stillness ready for something it didn't fully understand. And in that breathless pause it became clear that this wasn't just another summit. It was the start of something far more personal, far more dangerous than anyone had expected. Garrett Morrison owned the stage the moment he stepped back under the lights. He stripped off his jacket in one quick motion, revealing a tight black combat shirt that showed every line of muscle and ink. His movements were sharp, deliberate, and every step he took seemed to pull the entire room toward him. He flashed a quick grin, the kind that promised both danger and charm, and the crowd leaned forward, hanging on his every breath. Without hesitation, he called two assistants onto the stage men clad in padded suits who looked more like targets than helpers. Garrett's voice rang out strong and clear as he explained that tonight's lesson wasn't about fighting. It was about control. He launched into a ruthless demonstration, sweeping one assistant off his feet with a brutal leg hook, then pinning the other against the floor with a chokehold that had the man tapping out in seconds. His strikes were fast, loud, and perfectly timed with his words, each hit landing just as he delivered another cutting remark about business dominance. The audience erupted in cheers, clearly loving every bit of the spectacle. Garrett kept the energy high, pacing the stage with fire in his eyes. He spoke about leverage, about knowing when to strike, and about forcing others into submission before they even saw the trap. Every move, every phrase was wrapped in bravado, and the crowd responded with laughter, applause, and flashes of admiration. He finished the first round by flipping one assistant over his shoulder with a clean, punishing throw. The man hit the mat hard, and Garrett stood tall above him, chest-heaving sweat glistening on his forehead. The applause grew louder, a wave of approval sweeping through the room. But Garrett wasn't done. He wiped his face with a towel, then tossed it aside as he turned toward Chuck Norris, still seated calmly in the front row. The grin on Garrett's face widened, and his tone took on an even sharper edge. "You know, Garrett," said his voice booming over the speakers, "some people here believe that restraint is power, that quiet wins the game." He shook his head with a mocking laugh and pointed straight at Chuck. "Why don't we test that theory right now?" Garrett's challenge hit the room like a spark to dry grass. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they realized this wasn't just part of the show. He had just called out Chuck Norris in front of everyone. Garrett's voice dropped lower, but it carried even strongly through the stunned silence. "I say we stop talking about old stories and show them how the game is played today." He spread his arms wide, inviting Chuck to join him under the harsh stage lights. The room was electric, a storm waiting to break. All eyes locked on Chuck, waiting to see if the quiet man would rise. And Garrett stood there in the center, soaking in the pressure he had just unleashed, fully confident that he had the upper hand. For a long moment, Chuck Norris did not move. He sat in his chair, calm and unbothered, while every eye in the room darted back and forth between him and Garrett. The air was thick with tension, and no one dared to speak. Then, with quiet precision, Chuck slowly stood. He didn't glance around or play to the crowd. He simply rose-adjusted the cuffs of his simple dark shirt and began to walk toward the stage. His steps were steady and deliberate, each one soft but carrying weight. The room's earlier roar faded into a hush as people leaned in, caught by the strange gravity that followed him. Garrett's grin wavered slightly as he watched Chuck approach with unshaken calm. There was no rush in Chuck's movement, no hesitation. He walked as if time itself moved around him. His face composed, his gaze steady, and his focus unbroken. Even those who had been cheering for Garrett now sat frozen, unable to look away. Chuck reached the stairs and climbed them without a word. The stage lights cast a soft glow over him, highlighting every line on his face, every sign of a life well lived and disciplined. He stepped into the center of the stage, facing Garrett without fanfare. He didn't square up like a fighter preparing for a bout. Instead, he simply stood there relaxed but centered, as if rooted to the earth itself. Garrett shifted on his feet, a flicker of unease crossing his face. The difference between them was stark. Garrett's body was tense and coiled, ready to pounce. Chuck looked as though he had already won, not through arrogance, but through certainty. The crowd held its breath, waiting for something dramatic, but Chuck offered no theatrics. No sudden movements. He let the silence stretch, and somehow that quiet filled the room more than any loud speech could have. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Chuck finally spoke. His voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the space with ease. Balance is power. Watch closely. That was all he said. 5 words, spoken without force or flair, yet they seemed to settle over the crowd like a heavy fog. Garrett didn't reply. He only stared, suddenly unsure of the stage he had once controlled. The entire room seemed to lean forward, as one drawn into the quiet spell that had been cast. No one dared to speak, and every heartbeat felt louder than the last. The air was thick, the tension sharp, and in that moment it was clear that something far deeper than a fight was about to begin. Garrett moved first fast and sharp, closing the space between them with sudden, explosive speed. His first strike came low, a sweeping kick, aimed to take out Chuck's legs, the kind of move designed to end things quickly. But Chuck shifted just enough, his foot barely sliding, letting the attack miss by a fraction. Garrett didn't pause. He spun into a hook punch, his fist cutting through the air with practiced precision. But again, Chuck was gone before the blow could land. He hadn't jumped or ducked. He had simply flowed away from the strike like slipping through water. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Garrett's fists kept coming. Each punch was sharp, heavy, and designed to crush resistance. But Chuck wasn't there to be crushed. He moved with quiet ease, sidestepping, leaning, redirecting Garrett's momentum with the subtle turns of his body. Garrett's breath came faster as he pushed harder, trying to land a hit. He launched a knee toward Chuck's ribs, then followed it with a sharp elbow aimed at his jaw. Neither touched. Chuck's hands moved lightly, just enough to guide Garrett off balance, letting his strikes fall into empty space. It wasn't flashy. Chuck wasn't showing off. He didn't need to. Garrett's frustration began to show as his rhythm broke. His attacks became harder, his movements sharper, but they were starting to lose their precision. He was fighting not just an opponent, but a ghost that never stayed where expected. Chuck's face stayed calm, his breathing steady, as if he wasn't even exerting himself. He watched Garrett's every move, reading him before each attack even started. His feet barely shifted on the floor, yet Garrett couldn't pin him down. Garrett's jaw tightened as he threw a rapid combination, fists flying toward Chuck's chest and throat, trying to force him to react. But Chuck didn't flinch. He simply guided the strikes away, his palms soft, but firm, redirecting every ounce of force without a hint of struggle. The room felt smaller with every passing second, the energy dense and tight. Garrett was sweating now, his muscles tense from the effort of throwing punches that meant nothing but air and calm hands. He snarled under his breath and pressed in harder, launching his full body weight into a shoulder strike meant to knock Chuck off his feet. Chuck shifted slightly, letting the impact slide past him, and Garrett stumbled forward, caught by his own momentum. The crowd remained silent, too captivated to cheer or gasp. They could see the shift now, watching Garrett's confident aggression dissolve into something wilder, less controlled. Garrett's eyes flashed with something close to panic as he reset his stance. He lunged again, faster than before, driving forward, with a brutal force that left no room for mercy. Still, Chuck moved like wind through trees, always out of reach, always present, but untouchable. Each dodge from Chuck seemed smaller than the last, as if he needed even less effort to avoid Garrett's strikes. His face remained relaxed, his posture soft but unyielding. Garrett growled in frustration, his breath coming hard and loud as he launched another flurry. Sweat flew from his skin with every motion, his face growing red from the effort and from the sting of his helplessness. Chuck stayed centered, never rushing, never retreating too far, simply waiting for Garrett to burn himself out. His arms moved like flowing streams, catching and releasing Garrett's limbs with perfect timing. By now, Garrett's movements had lost their sharpness. His punches dragged just a little more his balance off by a hair, but enough for Chuck to see. Garrett swung again this time with more desperation than strategy. Chuck caught his wrist lightly and turned it aside, stepping just enough to make Garrett's body twist and stumble. The crowd's breath held as Garrett froze off balance, his body screaming for control he couldn't regain. Chuck didn't attack. He didn't need to. He simply stood there composed and still while Garrett's chest heaved from exhaustion and frustration. The room remained hushed, waiting for something to break. Garrett's face showed it all, the confusion, the disbelief, the creeping dread that maybe he wasn't in control at all. Chuck's eyes remained steady, unshaken, holding Garrett in place with nothing but presence. And Garrett realized, even as he fought with all his might, he had already lost this part of the fight without Chuck landing a single blow. Garrett's breath came fast, now ragged and shallow, his face flushed from the effort and frustration. His hands curled tight, knuckles white as he glared at Chuck standing so calmly before him. There was no more room for strategy or control. With a sudden roar, Garrett lunged forward, throwing every ounce of strength into his attack. His punches flew wild, abandoning all precision, driven only by rage and the need to break through. He swung hard again and again, chasing Chuck across the stage with nothing left but raw force. But Chuck did not run. He did not flinch. He simply waited. Garrett closed the distance with reckless speed, charging in with his body tilted forward, ready to slam into Chuck with full impact. He threw a looping strike meant to crush anything in its path. His feet pounded the floor, his momentum unstoppable. Chuck moved at the exact moment Garrett committed fully. There was no dramatic flourish, no flashy technique. Chuck shifted his weight slightly to the side, his stance rooted but fluid. His hand rose with a calm precision, palm open, meeting Garrett's chest right at the center. The strike was clean, soft, deceptively simple. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but the result was immediate. Garrett's body stopped in mid-motion, every muscle locking up at once. His breath caught in his throat, as if the air had been ripped out of his lungs. For a split second, he stood frozen, eyes wide with disbelief. Then his knees gave out. He dropped straight to the floor, his legs folding underneath him without resistance. His arms hung limp, unable to respond. He sat there gasping for air, stunned into silence. Chuck stood exactly where he had been, calm and steady, his hand already lowered back to his side. His breathing remained even, his face serene. No words were spoken, none were needed. Garrett's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had felt no pain, no crushing impact. Just a sudden wave of force that took everything away. The audience was completely silent, frozen by what they had witnessed. Garrett looked up at Chuck, still struggling to catch his breath. His chest burned not from injury, but from the weight of realization sinking in. This wasn't about strength. It wasn't about speed. It was something else entirely. Chuck's eyes met his steady and clear, holding no malice or triumph, just a quiet truth. Garrett sat there too shocked to speak, too humbled to rise. Everything he had believed in power domination, brute will, had crumbled in an instant with a single move that seemed too gentle to be real. Chuck remained still watching him with calm patience, giving him the space to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Garrett understood now, though. It shook him to his core. This wasn't a defeat. It was a lesson, and he had no choice but to absorb it. Garrett stayed on the floor, his breath still shaky, his mind racing to process what had just happened. His pride kept him there for a moment longer, caught between confusion and disbelief. But then, without a word, Chuck stepped toward him. Chuck extended his hand, steady and unhurried offering. It not as a victor, but as an equal. There was no trace of mockery or showmanship in his eyes, only quiet respect. Garrett hesitated, then slowly reached out, allowing Chuck to help him to his feet. The touch was firm, but there was no force behind it. Chuck pulled him up with smooth ease, then released his grip as soon as Garrett found his balance again. The room remained completely still, watching every move. Garrett stood there, his chest rising and falling, feeling the weight of something far heavier than physical exhaustion. His legs felt steady, but his thoughts were unsteady, shaken by a truth that could not be ignored. He looked at Chuck, seeing him differently now. Chuck's voice broke the silence, quiet, but clear enough for every ear in the room. Balance is power. Watch closely. The words struck differently this time, no longer sounding like a statement, but more like an invitation. Garrett heard them not as a lesson for others, but as a message meant for him alone. He nodded slowly, his expression no longer defiant, but humbled, his pride set aside. He understood that Chuck wasn't there to embarrass him. He was there to offer something Garrett had never truly known. The audience, who had come looking for spectacle, now sat in stunned reflection. They had witnessed something rare, something far beyond the surface of combat or strength. What had just unfolded wasn't a fight. It was a quiet unveiling of mastery. One by one, people began to clap. It wasn't loud or frenzied like earlier. It was soft, steady, and respectful, carrying more weight than any standing ovation could. Garrett stood alongside Chuck, feeling the applause, not as praise or shame, but as something deeper. It felt like acceptance, like understanding from every corner of the room. Chuck gave a slight nod, acknowledging the moment, but not claiming it. Then, with calm steps, he began to leave the stage, moving with the same quiet grace that had defined him from the start. Garrett remained still watching him go, knowing that the real victory wasn't in the match. It was in learning that true strength had nothing to prove. The weeks after the summit moved quickly, but Garrett Morrison felt every second drag. His name, once a symbol of dominance and power, now carried a weight that pressed down on him wherever he went. Headlines turned sharp overnight, painting him not as a fierce leader, but as a reckless man undone by his own arrogance. Bookstores pulled his titles from their shelves, his once best-selling guides to winning suddenly left untouched by readers who had once praised every word. His face vanished from conference posters, replaced by newer, safer names. The phones that once rang non-stop with offers and invitations now sat quiet, gathering dust in the corners of his empty office. Garrett refused to believe it at first. He told himself it was just a momentary storm, that people would come back once they remembered what he had done before. He sat at his desk day after day, watching his email inbox sit still, scrolling through old photos of packed events and roaring crowds. But no calls came, no messages, just silence. At night, he replayed the moment over and over, that single strike from Chuck, clean and quiet, dropping him like he had never learned to fight at all. He told himself it was a fluke, a trick, something staged that people would soon forget. But every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the same truth staring back at him. The man in the reflection wasn't the one from the photos anymore. Weeks turned into months, and Garrett found himself alone more often than not. The friends who once surrounded him, eager for his approval, stopped showing up. His team drifted away, their polite excuses barely masking their need to distance themselves from his fall. He started pacing his empty house, the walls feeling closer every day. His gym bag stayed packed by the door untouched since the night everything changed. His hands itched to strike something to hit back against the world that had turned on him. But deep down, he knew there was no one left to fight. One cold evening, the doorbell rang, breaking the quiet. Garrett opened the door to find Ethan standing there, calm as ever, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. There was no judgment in his eyes, just a quiet patience that somehow made Garrett's chest tighten. Ethan stepped inside without asking, taking in the bare living room with a glance. He didn't mention the unopened mail piled on the table or the untouched meals sitting cold on the counter. He just sat down and waited for Garrett to speak. Garrett stayed standing. His arms crossed, his voice low and bitter. He muttered about betrayal, about how the world loved to tear down anyone who dared to stand tall. He ranted about cowards, about fair-weather friends, about people who didn't understand what it took to lead. Ethan let him speak, never interrupting, never flinching. When Garrett's words finally ran out, leaving only heavy breaths and clenched fists, Ethan spoke softly. The fight was never about Chuck. Garrett's eyes narrowed, his body tensing, but Ethan's voice stayed steady. It was always about you and what you thought you had to prove. The words hit harder than any strike Garrett had ever taken. He opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. The weight of it settled on him, quiet and undeniable. Ethan stood, his expression kind but firm, and walked to the door. "You weren't fighting him," Ethan said gently. "You were fighting yourself." He left without another word, leaving Garrett alone in the dim light. Garrett sat down slowly, his legs weak under him, his head in his hands. The room around him seemed to shrink as the truth echoed in his ears. For the first time, there was no one else to blame, and he wasn't sure what to do with the emptiness left behind. Garrett drove for hours, leaving the city far behind as the roads grew narrower and the buildings gave way to open hills and quiet woods. He had no GPS guiding him this time, only a handwritten note with an address and a name that needed no introduction. The farther he went, the more the noise in his head began to fade, replaced by something unfamiliar and unsettling. When he finally reached the retreat, it was nothing like he expected. There were no signs, no gates, no cameras to mark the place. The building stood quietly among the trees, a simple wooden dojo with clean lines and a wide porch overlooking a small clearing. It looked untouched by time, as if it had been waiting for him long before he knew to find it. Garrett parked at the edge of the clearing, stepping out of his truck with hesitation, weighing every step. He felt the heat of shame rise in his chest as he approached, unsure if he would even be allowed through the door. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't explained himself. He had simply arrived because deep down he knew there was nowhere else left to go. Inside the dojo, the air was cool and still filled with the faint scent of cedar and incense. A few students moved quietly through the forms, their movements fluid and deliberate. No one stopped to stare at him. No one whispered. They simply trained their focus elsewhere. Then Chuck appeared from the far corner, dressed in a plain guy, his steps silent across the polished floor. He looked the same as before, calm and steady, carrying no weight of the past on his face. He didn't speak at first. He just studied Garrett with quiet eyes, reading everything without asking a word. Garrett's voice broke the silence, rough and low, as he forced himself to speak. "I need to learn." Chuck held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. Only one condition. Garrett swallowed, nodding quickly. No cameras, no stories, no press, just practice. The words carried no threat, only clarity. Garrett understood immediately. He nodded again, this time slower, feeling the weight of that agreement settle into his chest. Chuck motioned for him to follow, leading him outside to a smaller training area behind the dojo. The space was open, surrounded by trees with nothing but mats on the ground and a few wooden posts for practice. It was quiet there, with only the sound of wind moving through the branches above. They began with no formal introductions or speeches. Chuck simply showed him how to stand, adjusting Garrett's feet with gentle precision. His hands guided Garrett's shoulders, lowering the tension from muscles that had been tight for too long. Garrett followed in silence, feeling every small correction like a reminder of how far he had drifted from the basics. They moved slowly through simple drills, each movement stripped of force and speed. Chuck spoke little, letting the motions themselves do the teaching. He emphasized balance posture and breath-making. Garrett repeat the same steps over and over until the noise in his head began to fade. For the first time in years, Garrett wasn't fighting against anyone. He wasn't proving anything. He was just moving, listening, and learning. Hours passed unnoticed as they worked through the afternoon. Sweat gathered on Garrett's brow, but there was no strain in the work, only focus. Chuck watched carefully, offering a correction here and nod there, but never pushing too hard. As the sun began to lower, casting soft light through the trees, they paused. Chuck looked at Garrett, his voice as calm as it had been that night on the stage. Balance is power. Watch closely. Garrett didn't respond. He simply stood there breathing deeply, feeling something shift inside him. He realized then that the fight had never been about Chuck or anyone else. It had always been about himself, and for the first time he wasn't afraid to face it. Garrett unlocked the doors to Inner Circle Dojo just as the morning sun began to rise over the quiet neighborhood. The building was modest, tucked between a small bakery and a family-owned hardware store, its windows clear of flashy signs or advertisements. A simple wooden plaque hung above the entrance, carved with nothing more than the name and a small symbol of balance. Inside, the space was clean and open, with polished wooden floors and soft light filtering through wide windows. The walls were bare except for a single scroll that hung near the front, displaying one word in quiet calligraphy: discipline. Garrett moved through the dojo with ease, setting out mats and adjusting training gear without hurry. He no longer carried the weight of proving himself. There was no rush to impress anyone here. His first students arrived just as the clock struck 9, slipping through the door with quiet greetings and respectful bows. They weren't celebrities or executives looking for quick results. They were people from the neighborhood, young and old, drawn by quiet curiosity and word of mouth. Garrett welcomed them without grand speeches or bold promises. He guided them through basic stances, their feet steady and slow, teaching them to feel the ground beneath them before they ever thought about striking. His voice was calm and patient, and he offered small corrections with a gentle touch or a few soft words. He watched closely, not for mistakes, but for moments when a student found focus or stillness in the movement. There were no cameras in the room, no phones out recording clips to post online. Everything that happened inside the dojo stayed between teacher and student. Classes moved with quiet rhythm, built on breath and repetition, each person working at their own pace. Garrett's eyes stayed steady, guiding, without pressure showing them that real strength wasn't in speed or power, but in control and awareness. Outside the dojo, people began to notice the changes in his students. They moved differently, spoke with more calm, and carried themselves with quiet confidence. Word spread slowly but steadily, bringing new faces to Garrett's door, not through advertising, but through quiet respect. Garrett no longer cared about numbers or noise. His days were spent teaching, sweeping the floors, sharing tea with students after class, and watching them grow in ways that couldn't be measured by trophies or titles. Each evening, as he closed the dojo, he felt a peace that had once seemed impossible. He had no spotlight, no roaring crowds, no press-seeking interviews. But he had something far better. He had a purpose. And it was enough. Chuck Norris visited the dojo from time to time, always arriving quietly without notice or fanfare. He would step through the door, nodding to Garrett with a faint smile, and settle onto the wooden bench near the far wall. His presence alone seemed to calm the room, though no one dared make a scene about it. Garrett welcomed him with a respectful bow, but there was no longer any weight of intimidation between them. They moved together like old friends, not as master and student, but as men who had walked similar paths and understood where they led. Their shared history needed no words, yet their conversations carried meaning far beyond technique. They often spoke after class, seated on the back porch as the evening air cooled around them. Chuck would sip his tea slowly, his voice low and steady, offering quiet thoughts about discipline and the changing world. He spoke of balance not as something to achieve once, but as something to practice every day. Garrett listened closely, no longer seeking answers, but enjoying the simple act of learning from a man who had nothing left to prove. He shared his own thoughts, too, not as lessons, but as reflections often surprised by how different his views sounded from the man he had once been. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the rooftops, they sat watching the last students leave for the night. Chuck spoke about the dangers of turning martial arts into a show warning, how easy it was to trade wisdom for attention. Garrett nodded, knowing exactly what that temptation felt like. Chuck's words stayed calm, never sharp, but each one landed with quiet weight. He reminded Garrett that leadership wasn't about standing above others, but about walking beside them, guiding without pulling too hard. Garrett let the words sink in, feeling the truth behind them, then looked out at the quiet street beyond the window. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, and said softly, "My loudest victory was the day I stopped shouting." Chuck's face lit with a small, approving smile, and nothing else needed to be said. They sat together in peaceful silence. Two men connected not by competition, but by something far more lasting. The respect between them needed no audience and no applause. It was the kind of legacy that whispered instead of roared. It started quietly, just like everything else at Inner Circle Dojo. A few faces from Garrett's past showed up, former followers who had once praised his bold tactics and ruthless lessons. They walked through the door carrying that same old energy, expecting loud drills and hard words. Garrett greeted them with a calm nod, offering no speeches or promises. He simply invited them to join the class already in session, where students moved slowly and deliberately focused on balance and breath. The visitors looked confused at first, glancing around as if waiting for the real lesson to begin. But the lesson was already happening. Garrett led them through basic stances, his voice quiet but steady, teaching not how to conquer others, but how to steady themselves. He made no mention of winning or losing, only of presence and control. At first, some of the old students pushed back, asking about advanced techniques and faster results. Garrett never raised his voice. He just showed them with simple movements how strength without awareness led nowhere. Over time, something began to shift. The visitors returned, drawn back by the way they felt after leaving the dojo. The tension they carried started to loosen, replaced by something softer and more grounded. Garrett decided to hold a private seminar for those who sought more, calling it Inner Balance for Leaders. He kept it small, with no marketing and no cameras, just a circle of people sitting quietly on the mat. He spoke about stillness and restraint, using his own story as the lesson. He admitted his past mistakes openly, not as confessions, but as reminders that pride clouds judgment. He taught them how leadership wasn't about commanding others, but about mastering one's own reactions first. The students listened, their faces thoughtful, some visibly moved by the simplicity of it all. Garrett didn't preach or sell ideas. He just showed them how to breathe, how to ground their feet, and how to pause before making any choice. By the end of the seminar, no one asked about fighting. They asked about focus, about patience, about how to lead without losing themselves. That evening, after the last student left, Garrett stood near the entrance, quietly watching the empty room settle into silence again. Chuck appeared beside him, his steps soft, his presence as steady as always. They stood together, looking at a small framed letter that hung near the door, tucked between two simple photos of the dojo's early days. The letter, written in Chuck's familiar hand, read, "Power. Without humility is weakness in disguise." Garrett smiled faintly, his heart calm as he read the words again. He and Chuck said nothing. They didn't need to. The ripple had already begun, and they both knew it would keep spreading long after the noise faded. The Inner Circle Dojo had grown quietly over the past year. It was no longer just a room with mats and wooden beams. It had become a refuge for people from every corner of the community, a place where veterans, at-risk youth, and busy professionals came seeking something they couldn't name. Garrett moved through the space with ease, guiding students with calm words and steady hands. He no longer carried the weight of his past on his shoulders. Instead, he walked lighter, focused only on the people in front of him. The dojo's anniversary brought no banners or fanfare. It was marked with quiet gratitude, and students gathered for their regular practice, moving together in peaceful rhythm. There was no need for speeches. The lessons were spoken through every step, every breath, every moment of shared silence. Aya Chen arrived just as the morning session ended, her notebook tucked under her arm, her eyes scanning the room with quiet curiosity. She had covered Garrett's story before, back when everything had fallen apart. But this visit felt different. She watched as Garrett sat with a group of teenagers, listening closely as they shared their thoughts after class. There was no trace of the man she remembered from those headlines. He looked content, grounded, entirely at home in this simple place. Garrett noticed her presence and walked over with a calm smile, offering her tea without ceremony. They sat near the corner of the room, where soft sunlight filtered through the windows, casting gentle light across the floor. Aya asked about the changes and what had brought him here, but Garrett didn't offer rehearsed answers. He spoke plainly, sharing how he had learned to let go of control and listen instead of leading. He talked about balance, about teaching others to stand still before they ever threw a punch. She listened carefully, writing down every word, her face softening as she watched him interact with his students again. There was no performance here, no hidden agenda. One of the older veterans approached Garrett, offering a respectful bow and a quiet thank you for the guidance that had helped him rebuild his life. Aya's eyes followed the exchange, seeing the depth in that simple gesture, realizing it spoke more than any headline ever could. Garrett gave her a tour of the dojo, showing her the quiet garden out back where students often sat after class to reflect. He told her about the programs they had started, how they taught meditation alongside martial arts, how they helped people carry peace into their daily lives. She asked if he missed the old spotlight, the crowds, the stage. Garrett smiled softly and shook his head. Not even for a second. Later that evening, far from the city, Ethan arrived at Chuck's home in Texas. The house was quiet, surrounded by wide-open land and the steady hush of evening wind. They sat together on the back porch, sipping coffee, watching the last light slip over the horizon. Ethan told Chuck about the dojo's anniversary, about how Garrett had changed, and how people were quietly taking notice. He described Aya's visit and how even she seemed surprised by the depth of what she found there. Chuck listened with a faint smile, his eyes steady on the fading sky. He didn't interrupt, letting every word sink in before offering his own. He stopped talking. That's the clearest sign of all. The two men sat in peaceful silence, watching as the sky shifted from gold to deep blue, the stars beginning to appear one by one. There were no grand lessons left to share, no final warnings or advice. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the loudest victories are the ones no one hears. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying with it the calm of a day well lived. And, as the sun set fully behind the hills, everything felt still complete and right where it needed to be.